Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're continuing to look at reforms of the mid 19th century by spending a little bit of additional time looking at what would eventually becomes kind of, if you want to say, like the main reform. That's probably not the best way to put it, but the reform that eventually becomes the issue of the time, the one that eventually transcends all the other ones. And by the time we get to the 1850s, this movement, the anti-slavery movement or the abolition movement, will have surpassed women's rights, temperance, education, social utopias for sure, and other issues will sort of have to take a back seat to the abolition movement as other outside factors and forces are going to eventually push this one front and center. So this one starts out as a more minor movement, in the way that something like social utopias or other kinds of reform movements were. But as time goes along, it becomes more and more mainstream. Now, that is due to a lot of different things that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks, but it is also partially due to the persistence and the growing numbers of those people that were speaking up and speaking out against slavery. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this section, is looking at the abolition movement and slavery itself. We're going to spend a good bit of time in this section talking about American slavery and how it was continuing to grow in the American South in the decades of the 19th century, certainly after the founding of the Constitution, and how that was changing, how that was related to the economic changes being experienced in the North with industrialization, and how all those things were working together along with other outside factors, as I mentioned, to really put slavery into greater question. So let's begin today by talking about opposition to slavery, actually beginning with how slavery was opposed prior to the 1830s, 1840s, early opposition to slavery, because we're going to be focusing on the abolition movement. And once again, let's just make sure we're all clear on what abolition is. Abolition is the movement to abolish slavery, and an abolitionist was a person that believed in the cause of abolition or that worked for the cause of abolition. And it wasn't always just individuals. They formed groups and societies, groups like the American Anti-Slavery Society that worked tirelessly for decades to bring an end to slavery. Even once the Civil War begins, they are still working tirelessly to make sure that the ending slavery was included as a goal of that war. But before we get to these abolitionists, before we get to groups like the American Anti-Slavery Society and all of that, we want to look at what abolition was like prior to, let's say, about 1830, 1840, somewhere in there. How early arguments against slavery were formed and ways that abolition was oftentimes conducted in the early parts of the American Republic. So we can look at how it changes by the 1830s and 40s. So early opposition to slavery usually took a couple of forms. And first of all, we should also mention that early opposition to slavery was quite minimal. You did have a few groups, the Quakers, for example, had long been opposed to slavery, but there really wasn't a whole lot of outspoken criticism of slavery at the time. It was really just kind of accepted. And that criticism was very minor. It was not a mainstream thing. And it was typically certainly not coming from the South. It would have been coming from outside kind of sources. Other ways we could characterize early opposition to slavery is a common belief and a common practice amongst early abolitionists was they believed in something called gradualism, or they would be known as gradual abolitionists, and they believed in a concept of gradual abolition. Gradual, of course, means over time, slowly. So gradual abolitionists argued that slavery should be kind of phased out, that it should be a gradual process, and encouraged abolition that was not immediate. So they might suggest and supported ideas like maybe saying that from this point forward or from a certain year, all the children of slaves will be free, or that slave owners had the next 20 years or so to free their slaves voluntarily, that kind of thing. So more of a, we're going to phase it out and do it slowly over time. And this is the approach that a lot of northern states took when they started abolishing slavery in the decades following the American Revolution. Most of them did that on a gradual basis, where they sort of gradually just phased it out. And that's what a lot of early opposition to slavery, or a lot of early groups supported, and what they encouraged some slave owners to do. And that did result in the abolition of some people. They also might have believed in compensation. So compensation was another component of early opposition to slavery. then not necessarily both, but people could be both gradualists and also believe in compensation, or it could be one or the other. They're not, mutually exclusive things. But compensation, means to pay somebody for someone or to pay them back. So those who believed in compensation would have argued that slave owners should be paid for the slaves that they freed. And this was commonly used in the early days of phasing out slavery as well. So they would support a state paying slave owners for the value of the slaves that they freed. And this was used quite commonly in those early days. And a lot of slave owners would probably have expected to be compensated for slaves that they freed. Many also might have believed in the concept of colonization. Now, once again, these are not necessarily opposing ideas. You could have believed in all three. There were certain abolitionists that were gradualists that also believed in compensation and that might also believe in colonization. Colonization is not so much a how to free slaves, but a what to do when slaves are freed. Colonization advocates believed that slaves should be colonized, that they shouldn't stay in the United States, that they should be colonized back to Africa, and that they should support the funding and the creation of these colonies, these essentially settlements in West Africa that would be populated and settled by former slaves. Now, there's two ways to look at this, and truly people that supported colonization or that were involved in groups like the American Colonization Society that did this, it kind of could have come from two different ways. It does come from, for some of them, the perspective that the United States should remain a single race country, that people of African descent didn't have a place or shouldn't have a place in American society, and so it would be best for them to be relocated. It also comes with, or another way that could be looked at, and these are kind of similar, but the idea that African Americans would never truly be equal, that society was never going to treat them equally, and so it would be best for them. So it was kind of approached as a mutually beneficial thing. It's not, while it wasn't always a you shouldn't be here so you need to leave. That is partially kind of what it is. But colonization advocates would not have been in favor of sending people against their will or anything like that. And people that get involved in this, former slaves that choose colonization, did so voluntarily. But there were multiple colonies begun in West Africa. For example, Liberia. Liberia is today an independent country, but when it was first organized, it was a colony created by and settled by former slaves. And this did have some of a following. There were a lot of early abolitionists that supported the idea of colonization, that saw this as a good idea for a number of reasons, that also saw this as something that would make more people support abolition of slavery. That if you had, the prospect that freed slaves wouldn't stay in the United States, that maybe people would be more open to the idea of getting rid of slavery. Of course, colonization is not going to be a super popular option. It's not something that, it does happen. Obviously, there are a lot of people that saw promise in this, and there were plenty of freed slaves that did choose colonization and that voluntarily made that decision and moved to places like Liberia, or Sierra Leone is another example. But overall, it wasn't the most popular of options for a number of reasons. One, it's expensive and it's difficult to do. And groups like the American Colonization Society were always out fundraising and doing different events and things to try to not just raise awareness, but raise the money. But it is very expensive. And you also have to realize that for most people, most enslaved people in the United States, even if they did become free, they had no interest in moving to Africa. That, most of these people by this time, they have been in the United States for generations. They really, didn't have any direct or any known, kinship ties to Africa. And it didn't make sense to them, to relocate across the ocean to a place that was unknown. So it wasn't always hugely popular, but all of these ideas were used and were, and to some success that did result in the freedom of some people over a period of time. But the abolition movement, as we get to the 1830s and 1840s, begins to change. It begins to change in the language and the rhetoric that it uses. It starts to grow in size. It starts to grow in legitimacy. And that's what we want to look at next. What we were previously looking at is sometimes referred to as the old abolition. Like, it's the old way of looking at it, that slave owners should be compensated, that we should do this gradually over time, and that in many cases, freed slaves because they will never be equal, or because we don't want them to be equal, they shouldn't stay in the United States and they should be recolonized back to Africa, and all of that. But the abolition movement, as I said, takes a big turn in the 1830s and 40s. And what is causing that big turn, or the leading factor behind it, was the Second Great Awakening. We have already talked about how the Second Great Awakening inspired a great deal of reform, that the Second Great Awakening, with its message of good works and going out and doing good things and creating a more just, godly society, and this emphasis that anything can be saved, this does produce a very strong conviction in some people to look around their world and see the things that were not consistent with their Christian beliefs, and to see things that they saw as not being godly and to try to fix it. And so that is very much what's going to influence, certainly not all abolitionists, but many of them. It's probably, to me, it's the most obvious example of how religion dramatically affected these reformers, because so many of these abolitionists were just so deeply religiously convicted that did what they did and risked their lives because they believed that this was God's work and this was what God had called them to do, that slavery was sinful and just absolutely could not be tolerated. And so it's a deep religious conviction for many of them that causes them to take up this cause in the way that they do, and basically give everything else up in a lot of cases, and dedicate their life to doing just this one thing, not just as a side gig, but as a commitment that they make, many of them for the rest of their lives, or at least for decades, not something they're just involved in on the weekend. So the Second Great Awakening causes more people to question the morality of slavery, and that is ultimately the biggest difference between the old abolition and this new abolition. The new abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison, are attacking slavery from a moral standpoint, and that makes them dramatically different. So let's take a look at some of these new abolitionists. There are lots of them. We're going to highlight about three right here. And the person that really probably is the most well-known face of this new abolition, the abolition as it changes and grows and gains steam in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, Garrison is going to be at it all the way up to the actual abolition of slavery itself, is this guy, William Lloyd Garrison, who is pictured right here. So first of all, a white man. A lot of early abolition was focused entirely on, or a lot of the people speaking out against it were not white. There are exceptions to that, of course. It's not all the way true. Quakers, for example. But we're going to see, as we get to this new abolition, it is mixed. We see a response of not only white Americans, and it's not just African Americans. It is people working together, both white and black, to try to bring about an end to slavery. So that's partially what's happening here. But William Lloyd Garrison is what you would call an immediate abolitionist. So in an immediate abolitionist, that means he is advocating for the complete and total and immediate abolition of slavery, that it has to end right now. So none of this gradualism stuff. So that's one of the big differences, is that they are rejecting gradualism. They are rejecting compensation. They say that's not okay. And if this is morally wrong, if this is sinful, then why would we reward somebody for doing the right thing? Why would we reward somebody and pay them for stopping to do something that they shouldn't have been doing in the first place? So Garrison is incredibly outspoken and incredibly radical. And as he moves forward in his career, he becomes more and more and more a radical, eventually even kind of alienating himself from other abolitionists. A lot of other abolitionists felt that Garrison eventually starts taking things too far. But certainly in the earlier parts of his career, he is very adamant, again, that slavery has to end right now. And he attacks it morally. Garrison is one of these people that is deeply religiously convicted and just sees slavery as a sin, that it is a sin, it is a crime against God, and that the United States will pay for that sin if we do not atone for it. And so slavery had to end. Garrison starts publishing about the 1830s or so a newspaper called The Liberator. A way that a lot of these abolitionists got their message out was by writing, and Garrison was writing for decades this newspaper where he was attacking slavery, calling upon Southern slave owners to repent. Again, there is this very religious emphasis on this. Once again, the whole idea that even the worst of slave owners could be convinced to come around and could be convinced to become clean and rid themselves of slavery. And like I said, as time goes on, he becomes even more and more convicted in that and much more radical about it. And Garrison's also a little bit unusual in that a lot of abolitionists, particularly in the older days, focus on the abolition of slavery. They are certainly not speaking to equality or what we would call civil rights and those sorts of things, but Garrison does. Garrison believes not just in the end of slavery, he does believe in what we, even in arguably even in the 21st century, would see as racial equality, which makes him really quite interesting. He didn't think it was enough to free slaves. He thought, total equality, voting rights, full civil rights, everything. And that's common amongst some abolitionists, but certainly not true of all of them. So Garrison definitely represents this huge shift that the abolition movement is making, and that it is attacking slavery morally, calling it wrong, calling it sinful, and saying that it needed to be abolished immediately. Older abolitionists, again, calling for gradual abolition, and older abolitionists also tending to focus more on the economics of slavery, saying that it was economically backwards and not the best system, of labor, that there were better ways to do things out there. Other abolitionists of this time, another famous face that I bet you know, and that is Frederick Douglass. If William Lloyd Garrison is the most well-known white abolitionist of this era, most certainly the most famous African-American abolitionist, and really the most famous African-American of his time, was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is another that spends decades of his life, up until the absolute abolition of slavery itself, fighting for the end of slavery. And Frederick Douglass, obviously African-American, but also a former slave. Douglass was born a slave, escaped from slavery as a young man, as a teenager, but he had experienced firsthand the brutality of slavery. He had been beaten, he had been mistreated. He had all those experiences that he could write about, to put out to people. In a moment, we'll talk about how slave owners are really controlling the narrative about what slavery was like, and obviously not painting a very ugly picture at all. But then you've got people like Douglass out there painting a very real picture and a quite ugly one. And so Douglass works tirelessly for decades also to publish work, to make speeches, and is an incredibly well-known individual by even middle age. But he escaped slavery because he had been taught to read by a former owner or owner's wife, and was incredibly eloquent and just a beautiful writer and a beautiful speaker, and does a lot to bring awareness to abolition and to further the abolitionist cause. He, like Garrison, publishes a paper. His paper was called the North Star, where he wrote essays and articles and published other things in regard to anti-slavery. And Frederick Douglass, like I said, will be at it not just in the pre-Civil War era, but even after the Civil War, working to improve rights for African Americans even after slavery had ended. Another example of this new abolition is Sojourner Truth. And there are plenty more that we're not mentioning here. We'll learn about some of them through some other things that we will do. But Sojourner Truth is another example of a African American abolitionist, and in this case, a female abolitionist. Another thing about the abolitionist movement that we should point out as it's making this change is the inclusion of women. And it wasn't just white Americans and Black Americans, but also a significant number of women. Women oftentimes found themselves particularly drawn to the abolition movement and found common ground with it. And I think a lot of women, now Sojourner Truth was a former slave, so she certainly had firsthand experience the same way Douglass did, of being mistreated, of being beaten, of being hurt, and things like that. She was not so much known as a writer because she did not have the kind of education that Douglass did, but more as a speaker. And her eloquent speeches and beautiful voice and things, she traveled around giving talks and lectures, as a lot of these abolitionists did. And Sojourner Truth represents, and there's a lot of representations of this, but she represents this tie, this connection, and this kind of crossover in a way between abolition and women's rights. We're going to look a little bit later at women's rights, but as I was getting to just a moment ago, there's really a common ground, there's a common connection there, and a lot of abolitionists tended to favor or at least be sympathetic to the plight of women. And a lot of early women's rights activists were also abolitionists. That's how some of them actually get into women's rights. I think for a lot of women, they found some common ground in a way. And I know that that's a stretch, and we certainly don't want to equate um, the experience of privileged women to that of slaves, but some of them did find some common ground to say, we're not free either. Not the same. Obviously, it's not the same, but we don't have a voice either. So let us speak for those who also don't. So there is a lot of common ground between those things, between women and abolitionists. So next, let's turn to a little bit about slavery itself. Now that we've talked about what it is these abolitionists are arguing for, the abolition of slavery, what were some of the realities of slavery? What were some of those things that they were resisting? What were some of those untruths that they were trying to get straightened out? And how also did Southerners and slave owners respond, or even non-slave owners actually respond to the growth of the abolition movement in this period? So the story of slavery is such a difficult one to tell in such a short amount of time, keeping in mind, that there's no way we could ever really know or ever really express the experience of each individual person, because there's so much that we don't know. There are so many stories that we don't have record of. There are so many voices that we don't hear in this. So we keep that in mind as we are very much generalizing. And what we're saying here was certainly not true of everyone. We can just look at some of the general characteristics and things that we know that would have been true for many slaves. Now, we know that slavery is something that began growing in the colonial era. And there was actually, before we actually look at something about slavery itself, something that contributed more to the growth of slavery in this period. So as the North is becoming industrialized and more based in factories and diversifying and paid labor in the factories, the South is not moving in that direction at all. Ironically, they are moving the opposite, becoming even more deeply and even more further entrenched in agriculture as the North industrializes. But that is actually partially due to technology. New technology was making industrialization possible, and it was also enhancing agriculture as well. Some of those things make agriculture more productive. And the one of those that particularly pertained to the South, and that particularly, of course, related to slavery, was the cotton gin, which was invented by Eli Whitney in the 1790s. Eli Whitney technically does not actually come up with the concept of the cotton gin, but he knew how to market it and therefore gets the patent. But that's irrelevant. The point is what the cotton gin does. The cotton gin makes cotton production a lot easier. If you're familiar, one of the reasons that cotton, and we emphasize this when we looked at the colonies, I said that in the colonial period, cotton really wasn't being grown because cotton was not something that you could really make a profit off of. It took too long to produce it. It took too long to get the little seeds out of the cotton fibers that you could work all day and you wouldn't really have all that much to show for it. The cotton gin changes that. The cotton gin was this little contraption that you put the cotton in and you turned this little crank and it put it all through these little teeth, and those little teeth would separate the cotton fibers, the part that you use, and the seeds. So this makes cotton production profitable. This makes cotton production something that you can make money off of, and you can make a lot of money off of it. So it has a significant impact on the South. It makes cotton its number one crop, and it's going to expand the South. This is why some of that land that we've looked at in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, on and even into Texas, that was what was called the Cotton Belt, because those would become cotton producing territories and cotton producing states. And so if agriculture and cotton production is growing, that means slavery is growing too. So slavery increases tremendously as a result of the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s. There was a belief amongst a lot of people, and there even were some trends that would have suggested prior to the invention of the cotton gin that slavery was going to eventually die out. A lot of people thought that as the country expands, eventually people will see slavery as not being very beneficial and will get rid of it in favor of other labor systems. But after the invention of the cotton gin, that is most certainly not going to happen. The number of slaves in the South is going to practically quadruple in the decades following the invention of the cotton gin. So slavery has increased dramatically, and the South is not moving away from it anytime soon. In fact, it is probably far more important to the South's economy by the mid 19th century than it ever was in the colonial period. Now, despite all of that, slaves, of course, find remarkable ways to forge community, to have culture, and to have these bonds and these networks that enable them to really develop their own culture, to sustain that own culture, despite the fact that they were living under a system that was terribly abusive, that was just completely unjust. It is really a remarkable story of endurance, of resilience, of community, and of absolute resistance, in so many different ways. Of course, another reality of slavery that we must mention, of course, were those slave codes. This is again something we've talked about before. So, slave codes had existed really from the beginning of slavery itself, but it was these slave codes that made life under slavery, among other things, very, very difficult. Slave codes defined slaves as property. It defined them as a commodity that could be bought and sold. It took away any sense of rights, any sort of humanity. Slave codes put all kinds of tight restrictions on what slaves could and could not do. They could not own weapons. Marriages were not considered legal. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't defend themselves in court. They couldn't bring up charges against someone for any reason. Even just restrictions on their movement, that they couldn't be somewhere or go anywhere without written permission, these kind of things. Can't make their own money. It was illegal for slaves to know how to read or to write. It was illegal to teach a slave to know how to read or to write. But despite all of these terrible, terrible conditions, again, slaves are able to somehow find a way to cope and to survive and to create something that was culturally that's really quite remarkable that we're going to get to in just a moment. Now, we must also remember that there are a large number of free African Americans as well. So let's talk a little bit about them. So there were a large number of African Americans that were free in the United States. Now, most of them are going to be in the North, but there are some in the South. And these could have been people that were oftentimes slaves at some point in their life, and they may have been able to purchase their freedom in some kind of a way. There were cases where some of them might be able to make some kind of money for some kind of skill that they had, and they might have been able to purchase their own freedom. That was not true everywhere. Others have been freed for other reasons and in other ways. There are probably a little more than 250,000 or so at the height of slavery, the slavery days, height of this time, of free African Americans. But they were oftentimes these people were of mixed race. It was more common for people of mixed race to be free in society. But we should also remember that freedom did not necessarily mean rights, and it most certainly didn't mean equality. It could be more difficult for them to get jobs. There were certain, ways or jobs that would not hire them. Other kinds of things could be difficult to obtain: housing, education, all of that. So they are oftentimes poor, but not always the case. So life could still be difficult. There would still not be very many rights. Many of them still couldn't vote, even in the free states. Even in those states that did not allow slavery, still were not inclusive of all races in certain rights. So we have to mention that there were large numbers of them in some places. In the South, they're mostly going to be in your upper South states like Virginia and Maryland, and around some of those city areas. So there wouldn't be too many of them in the deep South. But voting rights, property rights, employment, all those kind of things would have been difficult to come by. So life could still be difficult even for those African Americans that were free. But moving on to slave culture, and I'm going to talk about each of these things sort of individually as we go along. Again, slave culture is really quite remarkable. And it's interesting, we looked at the cultural developments of this period and talked about them, how for the first time we're seeing writers that are creating unique styles of American writing, painters that are painting unique American landscapes, and that we're creating the first novels and the first poems and the first artistic styles that were unique to America, that weren't borrowed from Europe, that weren't looking for inspiration from Europe. But really and truly, that's not entirely true, or it is at the very least incomplete to think of American culture that way. What's interesting when you think about it is the first truly American culture, outside of Native American culture, of course, is African American culture. The first, other than outside of Native American culture, the first real culture that's being created here for the first time is that was being created by African Americans who were oftentimes enslaved as they blended African tradition, which is a blend of traditions in and of its own. They're talking about lots of different languages, lots of different traditions, lots of different religions, and blending that together with combining it with some elements of Native American culture, some elements of European culture, and creating something that really was truly unique. The first music that's really unique to America, again, outside of Native American music, is African American music. It is spirituals. It is those things that were created in oftentimes enslaved communities. The first stories that were really unique to the United States, anyway, are those folk tales that are being told by slaves and enslaved persons as they at the end of the day to entertain and to teach lessons. It's really quite remarkable when you think about it that that was able to be done. And slave culture really does tell partially that story of perseverance and endurance and finding ways to cope even under an incredibly abusive system. So for slave families, family was far more than just blood relation. Slave families, the reality is that slave family ties certainly weren't respected by the institution of slavery. It was very common for people to be separated from their actual blood families. It was very common to be sold away from parents or from children or from aunts and uncles, grandparents, spouses, other loved ones. And so therefore, slave families, they banded together, and when someone was sold away from their parents, other people stepped in and acted as their parents. So these kinship bonds are far, and this was common in African societies too, are far more strong and far more extensive than just by blood. But separation of families was incredibly common. African American religion, a mix of Christianity. Most African Americans, most enslaved people did practice Christianity, had been heavily influenced by both the First and the Second Great Awakening. But it is a mix of very European style Christianity with African influence, Caribbean influence. And for many slave families, for many enslaved people, religion was an incredible support. It was an incredible solace. Many of them found a lot of inspiring and encouraging principles in the Bible. There are many stories in the Bible, as I'm sure many of you know, of perseverance. There are stories of slavery. There are stories of people enduring slavery and captivity, but also just the overall stories of redemption, and that even if there is suffering in this life, that there is peace and redemption in the next life, is very inspiring to a lot of enslaved persons who would rely on scripture and religion and religious practices as one of those coping mechanisms. As much as it brought spiritual food, it was also something that allowed them to endure the situation that they were in. Slave culture also consists of their own music, stories, and poems and other sorts of things. Music, spirituals that we think of, work songs that were not only meant to entertain, not only meant to let's pass the time while we're doing this backbreaking work in the field, which is what most slaves did. But if you listen to the words of some of these spirituals and some of these work songs, they oftentimes they speak to being downtrodden. They speak to being in a system of oppression. They speak of that. There are lots of songs of perseverance and endurance and oppression and overcoming those things. There are a lot of stories in the Bible that then translate into music, these tributes to the poor and the oppressed, this promise of salvation. And so that was very important to a lot of this kind of double meaning of spiritual freedom and salvation, but also physical freedom from slavery that is brought up in those stories and those music and the spirituals and music as well. Stories, most of this, of course, oral tradition. A lot of stories told around the fire at night or in the cabins at night to entertain, but also to teach lessons. But many of these stories also, I'll give you an example, and this is probably less familiar to a lot of you now, but if you've heard of any of the Brer Rabbit stories, Brer Rabbit, Brer Bear, Brer Fox, those were common, and they later get put into a book by a white man and put into cartoons. Disney did cartoons back in the 30s of these. But those were originally slave folk tales, and the common theme in a lot of those folk tales was you had the rabbit against the fox or the bear. The fox or the bear being the predator there, and the rabbit, supposedly the weaker one. But in all of those stories, Brer Rabbit always wins. He always tricks Brer Bear and tricks Brer Fox into, outsmarts them and gets away, outsmarts them in some kind of situation, gets away, and is able to escape. And those stories like that of the underdog winning and the underdog being able to, through wits and through sneakiness and all that kind of stuff, being able to overcome these terrible situations. So many of the ways that slaves coped was with, creating this culture that also allowed them to assert individuality in a society that didn't really want them to have a personality, to have an identity, and people whose culture, whose native culture had been torn away from them, had been denied to them, that they had been taken from. This provided them that way to create cultural independence and to create something that was very, very unique, that was beneficial. And although it wasn't being valued at the time, something that later becomes really important for American culture in general. Now, it was people, of course, also resisted in more outward ways. There, of course, was resistance, and there was rebellion even to slavery during this time. Oftentimes, the story that we get of slavery is that slaves were very passive and just sort of accepted the system as it was, but that's absolutely not true. We know that slaves actively resisted slavery from the very beginning. And this is probably something that we don't even know how much was actually being done, because most of that resistance was usually quite passive. Passive resistance, like working very slowly or intentionally doing things wrong, breaking tools, harming animals or injuring the animals so they couldn't plow, or whatever the case was. Some of that, a lot of that was absolutely acts of resistance, just little subtle things that might not get them in trouble, that they could more easily get away with without being whipped or beaten or sold or something like that. And there's no telling how much that happened. There's also a lot of speculation that this is where the stereotypes that slave owners and overseers would have of African Americans being lazy and being unintelligent. A lot of the time that was, faked. That was a feigned thing to not be punished or to cover up some of the things that they were doing. Now, of course, rebellion, outright rebellion against slavery, is one of the least common ways that slaves resisted, but it did happen. And there's no telling how many rebellions were plotted, how many people thought about it before actually doing it. And we should also mention running away. Running away was extremely common as well. There are probably about 50,000 slaves a year that escape, some of them maybe not successfully, but that attempt to escape to further south, if you're talking about prior to the acquisition of Florida, to Canada, places like that. So slave running away was quite common also. But rebellion is something that doesn't happen a lot. But when it does happen, of course, it's quite significant. There are multiple ones that were found out before. There was a slave, Gabriel Prosser, that was caught before rebellion could actually be taken out. But one of the most successful slave revolts in the United States was the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831. Nat Turner was a slave in Virginia, very much inspired by religion. As a lot of reformers were in this period, he truly believed, he was sort of a self-anointed preacher who believed that he was on this divine mission, believed firmly that God had called him to lead a revolt. He saw an eclipse one night and took that as a sign that God was leading him to lead this revolt. And so he rounded up, got some followers, and a couple of nights in Virginia, they ran through the countryside of Virginia, stopping at every farmhouse, plantation, and killing all the white people that they found. They ended up killing about 57 people before they were all rounded up and captured, and eventually other accomplices were captured along with Nat Turner. There was a manhunt that went on for him for weeks and weeks and weeks over trying to find him before he was captured and eventually executed. So the Nat Turner Revolt, while certainly not successful in overturning the system of slavery, it did terrify people, and it did result in the death of more than 50 people. They were able to kill in that whole process. And that is something that absolutely terrified slave owners, the whole concept of the slave revolt. That is why you see the tightening of slave codes and things like that. But furthermore, as we're going to see in a moment, things like the Nat Turner Revolt, Southerners wanted to put a stop to those things, not just because it meant a threat to slavery, but as we're going to see in a second, slave owners, of course, are trying to control the narrative about slavery itself and trying to make this argument that slavery is fine and that everything is fine and slaves do not want to be free. They don't need to be free. We don't mistreat them. It is a very, very civilized and kind and peaceful system. But then when you have something like the Nat Turner Revolt, that completely undermines that argument, and that completely supports what the abolitionists are saying, is that this is cruel and brutal and people are being oppressed. So they certainly want to silence that kind of stuff. So speaking of silencing that kind of stuff, let's take a look at how slave owners defended the institution of slavery. What were their ways in which they argued that slavery wasn't wrong, wasn't violent, wasn't cruel, and how did they react when abolitionists start to gain all this momentum, or trying to gain momentum, in the 1830s and 40s, arguing that slavery was wrong and calling for its end? We're going to look first at response in the North, or response in the free states, response from those that weren't even slave owners, which may be surprising. We oftentimes want to think that all Northerners or all people in the free states were in favor of ending slavery, that everybody was an abolitionist, that either you were a slave owner or you were an abolitionist, and that's absolutely not the case. The response from the North in the 1830s, 1840s is generally one that's quite hostile. A lot of Northerners and non-slave owners were generally very, very hostile, or at best indifferent to the abolition movement. There's a lot of backlash against abolitionists. There are demonstrations. Abolitionists are threatened. They are targeted. They are harassed. And not just from Southerners. Some of that is coming from the northern states, from free states, from people that do not own slaves at all. Quite a shock to a lot of abolitionists to get that kind of reception, even from the free states, and kind of makes them wonder, if the free state people think this way, what are the Southern people going to think? Slave owner people going to think? But a lot of Northerners either are just kind of indifferent to it, but we have to remember that just because they did not practice slavery does not mean they believed in equality. And so that was a concern of, okay, if we end slavery, does that mean we have to give all these people freedom and rights? And they didn't want to share that. Concerned that they would all move to the North and take jobs. They didn't want that. And just, disrupting the South's economy sounded kind of scary, because the South's economy was important to the United States' economy as a whole. So that was a tricky question. So there is a lot of negative reaction, even from the North, threatening them. There is violence, there's mobs, there's attacks, and that's just from the North. Now, later we will look at different things that cause a lot of people, especially in the North, to come around to abolition and to start supporting it more. But for the most part, at first, when people like William Lloyd Garrison first start saying some of this stuff really, really loudly, they are not met with a whole lot of acceptance. So you can assume if people in the free states are not going to be met with a whole lot of acceptance, that is certainly going to be true of the South as well. The South, of course, is very, very hostile to the abolition movement. But before we get to that part, let's take a look at how Southerners were just defending the very idea of slavery. Of course, there is the big economic argument that slavery was an economic necessity, that slavery was important for the very survival of the South's economy, keeping in mind the importance of cotton to the entire economy of the United States. It really was the most valuable thing that the United States economy was producing. More powerful than the North's factories and all of that. So they do argue that without slavery, the South's economy will collapse, and there goes the economy of the entire United States. But they also defend slavery with these arguments that it is not wrong, it is not abusive, that this is actually the best thing for African Americans. So those could be worded and are sometimes articulated in what's sometimes called the positive good argument. Now, I have the happy slave argument up there as well. They are similar, but let's look at the positive good argument first. The positive good argument, and please understand, this is based off of what were widely accepted, although today very disturbing attitudes that are, of course, based in deep racism. The positive good argument argues that slavery was the best thing for African Americans because they were not fit for freedom. They were somehow not capable of freedom, that they were not intelligent enough, that they were childlike, that they needed to be looked after, and that they wouldn't survive on their own. So enslavement was the best thing for them because they were being taken care of, because this was a system that provided for them. This was the kind of work they were best suited for. They were not intelligent enough to obtain other kinds of education or jobs, that they were just inherently inferior. And so this was a kind system that was actually kind of doing them a favor, that it was a positive good for that reason, that it wasn't just an economic benefit, that this was best for African Americans because they weren't fit for much else. The happy slave argument is similar, but this is the argument that slaves were not resisting, that slaves did not, that it wasn't cruel, that they weren't trying to get away, that they enjoyed their enslavement, that there was a bond between slaves and slave owners, that there was an intimacy between them, that this was more like a parent-child relationship than anything else. And that happy slave argument often shows up in pictures like the one you see right here. Here you see the slave owners right there with their enslaved persons, that are dancing and they're smiling. Look how well dressed they are. So you oftentimes will see images of slaves with the big smile and playing music and dancing, and they're just sort of like, it's all like a big happy family kind of a thing, that they don't want freedom, that they do not want it. And the only reason you see things like Nat Turner revolt and stuff like that is because abolitionists are egging them on. The abolitionists are just sort of whipping up trouble and just agitating people that shouldn't be agitated about that. They are also going to defend slavery using the Bible. They actually use religion to defend slavery as well. They will use biblical arguments to support the institution of slavery. They point out certain scriptures, certain passages in the Bible. There are some passages in Hebrews, for example. In the writings of Paul, there is mention of slaves obeying their masters. They point out that Christ himself never said anything about slavery. And so they take that to mean that slavery must be ordained by God. And they truly, in Genesis, and they even, this biblical argument is more than just, well, nothing's bad is said about it here and it's mentioned here or there. They truly believe that this is a God ordained system, that God willed it, and that God created people of African descent to be enslaved, and that this was something that was fulfilling God's purpose. And as terrible as that sounds, and it was controversial, really, this actually causes a lot of splits in some religious denominations. It's actually where Southern Baptists come from, because the Baptists in the United States didn't want to appoint slave owners to foreign missionary work. And Southerners, of course, argued that slavery was God ordained. And so you have the split there, and you get the what eventually becomes the Southern Baptist Convention. Of course, those are not things they would agree with today, but that is where it comes from. Now, another way they respond is by just not listening to abolitionists, trying to block them. There's all kinds of banning of abolitionist literature. They do not allow the publication of things like the Liberator, the North Star. There are other abolitionists that are writing all kinds of things. They don't allow that stuff to be delivered, and you can get arrested for having it. And that does keep some of it out, but it doesn't keep all of it out, as you can probably imagine. But they resort to actual censorship to try to quiet abolitionists and, shut them up. So to make it not easy to obtain abolitionist literature, so as not to get that information out there to enslaved people, for sure. And finally, we also see Congress reacting to this hostility. The House of Representatives passed in 1836 a gag rule. So this is at the national level, the House of Representatives. The gag rule, if you put a gag on somebody, it's like covering their mouth so they can't speak. The gag rule meant that Congress, not people, but Congress, would not discuss, not even entertain any sort of discussion whatsoever on anything that was considered hostile to slavery. At this point in time, Southerners had the votes to do this, so they were able to pass this gag rule, meaning that if anything came up for discussion that they felt was hostile to slavery or that threatened slavery in some sort of a way, it would immediately be tabled. They would not even discuss it. Now, that gag rule won't last forever, but for a while, they are able to, really control and many times manipulate the conversation surrounding slavery. So, as I mentioned, this one on abolition, this is eventually going to become the issue. This will eventually become the reform movement that can't be ignored. But we are going to see a couple other things transpire before that to make that be the case. So, we will continue to look at the growth of the abolition movement and talk about ways that do, or things that do, push this to the center and cause other reform movements like women's rights and temperance and education to eventually have to take a back seat to abolition.